It's the burned Porsche that is a key piece of evidence the prosecution is using in the sex trafficking and racketeering trial of Sean Diddy Combs. Rapper Kid Cudi says Combs had something to do with a Molotov cocktail landing in his passenger seat in January 2012. Diddy's defense is saying not so fast. The DNA evidence, they argue, could derail the government's attempt to use this charred car as a smoking gun in trying to convince a jury that Sean Combs is guilty. We're on the case presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. Before we get back to this episode of On the Case, I want to bring you a Law&Crime legal alert, because if you received a Depo-Provera birth control shot and you were later diagnosed with a spinal or brain tumor called meningioma, you may be eligible for a lawsuit. Morgan & Morgan is investigating claims that patients were not properly warned about this risk. It's free to check, it takes just a few minutes, and you don't have to pay unless they win. So scan the QR code on your screen. You can also use the link in the description below, or go to www.forthepeople.com/LCDEPO to see if you qualify. A key witness this week is expected to take the stand in the trial of Sean Diddy Combs. It's a fire investigator from the Los Angeles Fire Department. That investigator responded to the house of rapper Kid Cudi in LA in January 2012, and this is what they found. That is the rapper's Porsche, damaged from a Molotov cocktail. Yeah, an explosive built with a bottle full of flammable liquid that typically has a cloth inserted to act like a wick. Kid Cudi took the stand last week. He entered the courthouse smoking a cigarette, wearing a leather jacket, and a white t-shirt. Now, Kid Cudi's real name is Scott Miscuddy. He dated Cassandra Ventura, Diddy's ex, the singer known as Cassie, briefly in 2011, and he says that Sean Combs did not like that one bit. Ventura and Combs were in an off-again, on-again relationship that started around 2008 and went to 2018. Kid Cudi testified that he thought when he was with Cassie that Ventura and Combs were done. Before we get into how Kid Cudi's car was almost engulfed in flames from a Molotov cocktail, it is important to remind you why an arson case is so important in the government's attempt to convict Sean Combs of racketeering. Arson is one of the predicate offenses under the RICO Act. The government needs to prove at least 2 underlying crimes to be guilty of racketeering conspiracy, and arson is one of those potential underlying crimes, so you can see why a potential burnt Porsche may go a long way in the government's case. The road to that burned Porsche started back when Kid Cudi says he and Ventura first started dating. Kid Cudi testified that he met Cassie at an event in New York in 2008. They also collabed on some music together, and then they briefly dated in 2011. Now, the rapper said as he understood it, Cassie and, quote, Sean Combs had some problems and they weren't dating anymore. But then Ventura told Kid Cudi that Diddy had found out they were dating. Now, Kid Cudi said he was confused because he didn't think that Diddy and Cassie were speaking anymore. He then testified that Ventura asked him to pick her up because she was worried that Diddy was going to show up at Kid Cudi's house because Diddy asked for Kid Cudi's address and she gave that address to Diddy. Now, Kid Cudi then said that Cassie was told by a friend, Capricorn Clark, who was also testifying at the trial, she worked as an assistant to Sean Combs, that Diddy and an associate of Diddy were actually inside Kid Cudi's house because she was waiting in the car outside. Now, this was in December 2011. Kid Cudi said that he called Diddy. He confronted him on the phone about an alleged break-in to his house, and Kid Cudi said he then called the police, who filed a report. Then we get to January 2012, and this is key. Kid Cudi said he received a call from his dog sitter that his Porsche was on fire. Now, here are some of the images that the government submitted as evidence of the damage that Molotov cocktail left behind. Kid Cudi said he and Ventura were no longer dating at the time of this fire. Kid Cudi testified that he saw the Molotov cocktail in the front seat of the car and that police were called to his house. In one of the most candid moments of this trial thus far, when asked what his reaction was to his car being set on fire, Kid Cudi replied, "What the..." And you can fill in the blank on that one. Now, Kid Cudi said that he confronted Combs about his car. The two had a sit down to talk about Cassie, the alleged break-in, and what happened to his car. Kid Cudi testified at the end of that meeting. Kid Cudi says he stood up and shook hands with Sean Combs. Quote, "As I was shaking his hand, I said, 'What are we going to do about my car?' I made sure to ask him right when our hands were clasped together, where he couldn't run away, and I could look him square in his eye, and he looked right back at me, a very cold stare, and said, 'I don't know what you're talking about.' I said, 'Okay.' I took my hand from his and he said, 'Wait, I thought we were cool. Is there a problem?' I was like, 'You said you didn't burn my car, right? You said that's your word?' And he said, 'Yeah.' And I was like, 'That's it.'" Cudi said that Combs was very calm during that part of the conversation. Heading into that line of testimony, Cudi had said that he thought Combs had something to do with the break-in and his car being lit on fire based on issues that they were having off of the relationship that he had had for a short period of time with Cassie. On cross-examination, the defense tried to poke holes in what Kid Cudi was saying and to raise questions about whether Diddy would actually have something to do with this alleged arson. The defense pointed out that no one has been charged in this case, even though police were called and the LAFD investigated. They also said that fingerprints and DNA were taken from the scene. Then the defense said to Kid Cudi, quote, "You know that DNA comes back to a female, right?" The rapper responded, "You said what now?" And the defense said, "The DNA comes back to the female." It seemed like that line caught Kid Cudi off guard. This week, the government filed this motion ahead of the testimony of this LAFD investigator they plan to call to the stand. And it seems like they're trying to get ahead of the argument that the defense is going to make in connection to that burned Porsche, that there's no physical evidence that Combs was there or involved, and it was a female's DNA that was taken from the Molotov cocktail, according to the defense. Now, the government said they plan to call the LAFD fire investigator who responded to Kid Cudi's house in 2012, but they wanted to stop the defense from questioning that investigator about DNA. Part of the motion reads, quote, "Investigator Jimenez did not collect the swabs personally, did not perform the testing himself, has no personal knowledge regarding the testing other than what is included in his report and the additional materials, and does not understand and cannot explain to what partial female DNA refers." The government also says the evidence doesn't talk about which part of the glass bottle the DNA was collected from. That was the first issue that was brought up in court Tuesday morning, and the judge overruled the objection, meaning the defense will have their chance to ask the LAFD fire investigator about the DNA and bring up what was partially found on that Molotov cocktail to the jury once again. Combs' trial is expected to last another month at least. He is charged with racketeering, sex trafficking by force, and transportation to engage in prostitution. He has pleaded not guilty. Join us now to talk about this part of this case involving Sean Diddy Combs is Nima Rahmani, former federal prosecutor and president of West Coast Trial Lawyers. Always great to have you on Law and Crime. Thanks for being here. So there's so much attention on this Porsche that was hit with a Molotov cocktail in 2012. It was Kid Cudi's. And the government's trying to argue that Sean Combs was responsible for this Molotov cocktail. How do you do that?
Well, I think there's a few ways you get there. Obviously, you would love if there was some sort of video or an admission, but you don't have that, right? So what you have is this threat. Cassie testified that Combs threatened to blow up Kid Cudi's car. And lo and behold, a short time thereafter, a Molotov cocktail hit the Porsche and it was burned. So, that's certainly circumstantial evidence that Combs was responsible for it, adding to the episode where, he went into Kid Cudi's home, apparently with a gun. And, you have people like Kid Cudi, Cassie Ventura, and Capricorn Clark who have now testified that, Combs was responsible for that incident. Now, obviously, Combs denied it when he was confronted with it, but I think there's certainly enough evidence for the jury to infer that he was responsible for this arson, even if he wasn't the one who directly did it.
How legally, kind of break down how that works, because this case was investigated in 2012. The defense made sure in talking to Kid Cudi that to point out that no one was ever arrested for arson. Sean Combs was never charged for arson. Had this event happened last week and there was evidence of him doing it, he would face a charge, reasonable to believe that he would face a charge of arson. But in this case, it's kind of all this circumstantial evidence to get the jury to believe, if you're the government, that Sean Combs did this. How does that work, where it's not as if he's ever been charged with arson?
Look, it's circumstantial, but if I'm the prosecutor, and maybe this is the former prosecutor. I mean, just because someone isn't charged doesn't mean that they're not guilty of an offense, or that offense isn't an element of another crime. I would say the same thing about the 2016 hotel assault. Combs was never charged for that, but some of this is witness intimidation. Some of it is people who are afraid to speak out. And you heard Cassie testify that she just wanted to get away from the Intercontinental Hotel, and that Kid Cudi was afraid for his own safety, and he did not want to have anything to do with Combs or even Cassie Ventura for that matter after this arson incident. So, sometimes if you are a prosecutor or law enforcement and you have victims and witnesses who aren't willing to come forward and testify, that can really tank your case. But that doesn't mean that at some other time, like today during this trial, that crime can't be proven.
And we talked about it a little bit in the lead in of some of the underlying crimes that then can lead to the racketeering charge that Sean Combs is facing. Just as you're the former prosecutor, why is arson and this Porsche so important when making that argument towards Sean Combs being guilty of racketeering?
Chris, this is why arson is important. There is a way for the government to get to racketeering even if they can't prove sex trafficking. So let's talk about sex trafficking first. Sex trafficking, of course, requires force, fraud, or coercion. There's an argument that the defense has put out that the freak offs were consensual. There was no force, there was no coercion. And some of the emails and text messages that Cassie sent Combs do seem to support that argument. Now, obviously, I believe that she was coerced, and this is just part of the psychology of abuse. But one of the biggest questions in the case is, well, why did Cassie stay if she was really forced or she was coerced into participating in these sex acts? The reason arson and kidnapping and prostitution and these other offenses are important is that they are RICO predicate acts. So if the jury believes there's a criminal enterprise, and even if they don't believe the sex trafficking happened, they can convict Combs on racketeering for arson, for kidnapping, for drug trafficking, for some of these other crimes that don't have to do with sex trafficking if they do believe that the freak-offs were consensual.
And let's talk about this DNA, the partial DNA that the defense brought up when they were cross-examining Kid Cudi. And it seemed like he didn't expect that part of the questioning to come up, that the defense claims that there was partial DNA from the Molotov cocktail or what was left of it in the car, and it was a female's DNA. What do you make of that?
It's very possible that a female was responsible for the Molotov cocktail, or it was just an innocent female who was there. All along, Combs said that if something happened to Kid Cudi, it would be by someone else's hand. In fact, he said he would be out of the country. This is testimony from Regina Ventura, Cassie's mother, and why she wired the $20,000 to him, because she was afraid for her daughter's safety. And now you have all these individuals saying that, it wasn't necessarily Combs himself who would, do the dirty work, right? It could be a lie detector test. It could be using a security guard. He was running a criminal enterprise. And just like the head of the mob isn't the one who always pulls the trigger for a mob hit, I think the jurors can certainly infer that it was Combs who ordered the arson, even if it wasn't him who did it personally.
And if you're the prosecution, would you be expecting that piece? Because it seemed like Kid Cudi, everything to that point, he was kind of expecting all the the questions that he was getting, and he was as cordial and calm as a witness can be with some of the language he had when he was on the stand. But do you think the prosecution knew of that DNA test and that was going to come up?
I don't think they knew about it because Kid Cudi did seem surprised. He certainly wasn't prepped for it. Well, when you're the defense, you can cross on anything. You don't necessarily have to prove that it was a female's DNA. You can ask, as long as you have a good faith basis to believe that some other DNA was in the car, you can ask a witness about it. That doesn't mean it's true. That doesn't mean we'll ever hear from anyone who conducted the investigation as to whose DNA that was. I mean, again, it's possible, but not necessary. It's certainly something I don't think the government's going to put in because it wasn't Combs's DNA.
And for the prosecution, now that the judge is allowing the defense for when this fire investigator takes the stand, they will be able to bring up this DNA, this partial female DNA that they found on it. If you're the prosecution, how do you go about, because I'm sure it's going to come up and a juror may, you may see a juror start to think, well, maybe Sean Combs isn't responsible for this arson. How do you, as a prosecutor, if you were in their shoes, push back on that and then try to get the jury on track?
I think you got to really talk about the difference between direct and circumstantial evidence. And there's jury instructions on this that really give different examples. And you don't need direct evidence. Circumstantial evidence is entitled to the same weight. So the example that they use in jury instructions is, if you go outside and you see it's raining, you can testify that, it was raining on this particular day. But even if you're inside and someone walks into your house and they're wet and they have an umbrella and they have rain boots, you can reasonably infer that it was raining. And here, given all the evidence, the fact that Combs himself made that threat, that he had the motive to go after Kid Cudi, he threatened to kill him. He said he was going to blow up his car. And the fact that that happened, you can infer that it was Combs who at least ordered it. And again, sometime later, years later, apparently there was some sort of vague apology for what happened as well. So I think all that, the totality of the circumstances, do give rise to the conclusion that Combs was responsible. You don't need that direct evidence in the case.
When a fire investigator is brought to the stand, and he'll be questioned about the DNA, he didn't do the swabs, the government says, but this is the person who saw the car that day in 2012 in January when he was called to Kid Cudi's house in Los Angeles. What do you expect? What information would the government want from a witness like that?
I think they're going to talk about the accelerant, right? The source of the fire to prove that, it was indeed a Molotov cocktail, right? That's something that you need an expert to testify to. I don't think, it came out during Kid Cudi's testimony. It's not something that obviously he can opine to because he's not an expert in fire and what can cause a vehicle or anything like that to catch on fire. So you really do need that testimony from, a fire expert. So that's what I expect that to say.
And now, as I know, Capricorn Clark was on the stand today, and she was talking about, saying that she was kidnapped at one point, and then that is also one of those underlying crimes. You have the arson in allegedly with Kid Cudi's car. To this point, how do you feel the government is doing? We still have a long way to go in this trial in proving that racketeering charge.
I think the government is there. And again, it's not your typical racketeering case, right? We talked about the mob. Normally you deal with racketeering with cartels or street gangs, but we are seeing them more and more in these sex trafficking cases. Obviously, R. Kelly's the best example, but the NXIVM sex cult case. Look, you have someone that has people working for him, right? That's Sean Combs. So the criminal enterprise doesn't have to be a criminal organization as long as it's a loose association of two or more people and someone's calling the shots. That's what's happening here. You have people that are working for Combs. So, we talked about arson. I think that's proven. But then you have kidnapping. Kidnapping isn't what some people think it is. You don't have to be, snatched off the middle of the street in broad daylight and thrown into a white van. You just have to prevent someone from moving through force or to force someone into a situation using force. So, you have the hotel incident. Well, the fact that you have Combs physically dragging Cassie Ventura in the hallway and not allowing her to leave, that is kidnapping. I mean, we've seen video evidence of kidnapping. Then you have Combs apparently upset with Clark because she didn't tell him about Cassie's relationship with Kid Cudi, and the fact that she called Cassie using a burner phone, warning her and Kid Cudi not to come to the house. And then apparently Combs took Clark to some club and held her there. That's kidnapping. That's evidence of kidnapping. So now you have two kidnapping events. At least we may hear about more. So you're just adding the different elements of those RICO predicate acts as the government. I do think they have proven racketeering in this case.
What more would you need to see if you were a juror at this point from the government? If a juror is maybe at this point like, okay, I've heard this, but we still have several weeks to go where the prosecution is going to lay out its case, where do you think it's going to go next?
What I would love to see if I were a juror in this case or if I were prosecuting this case are more videos. And apparently Combs took video of these freak-offs for his own sexual pleasure and to maintain control over the victims. If those videos exist, I would want to see them because video is the best evidence. And we know it's the best evidence because this case was all about that hotel surveillance video. Both before the trial, during jury selection, and during the trial. That's what the government started with. Video doesn't lie, Chris. Witnesses can lie. Some of these witnesses are disgruntled exes, allegedly, maybe disgruntled employees, allegedly. Some of them have filed civil lawsuits. So they can potentially be biased. I'm not saying I agree with it, but this is the argument the defense is making. But video evidence, it doesn't lie. And apparently, there's video from Combs's homes in LA and Miami. He allegedly had videos all throughout the house, hidden cameras. So to the extent that those videos exist, that's what I would want to see if I were a juror in this case.
And we talked about the racketeering charge, and you believe at this point that the government's there. How about at sex trafficking at this point? I mean, there's been some very compelling testimony from what we've been told from our reporter in the courtroom. Just the emotion of Cassie's testimony was something that was incredibly emotional. At this point, is the government there as well on that charge?
Chris, I do believe the government is there. Maybe this is the former prosecutor in me, but sex trafficking, again, it's not human trafficking, right? There is sex that's consensual between adults, and there's non-consensual sex that involves force, fraud, or coercion. There has to be a commercial element, and we know there is because of the payment to the sex workers. And of course, the commercial element doesn't even have to be financial. It has to be just some benefit to individuals involved. And then there has to be an interstate component, which again, we know there is because people were flown from different states to participate in these sex acts. So really, sex trafficking comes down to that force or coercion. Do you believe that Cassie was coerced? I do, because someone that, takes so many drugs that she throws up during the freak off, someone who's forced to have sex while she's on her period or when she has a UTI, that is coerced, in my opinion. And you have Combs here, who has a history of violence directly towards Cassie. He has security, he has guns. That is enough force, in my opinion, for this to not be consensual sex, no matter how freaky it is between adults, and has crossed the line to sex trafficking, in my opinion. And yet, Don Hughes, the government's expert, who testified about the psychology of abuse and why victims stay and why they don't seek help and why they don't report it. So I think that was very compelling testimony as well.
And then, even as a former prosecutor, to this point, if you had to say something that Diddy's defense was doing well, what would you say they've done to this point?
I think Diddy's done a couple of things well. One, they're using Cassie's own words against her. Those emails, those text messages, I thought they were damaging for the prosecution. If I were the government, I would have gotten a lot of that out on direct as well and just fronted that bad evidence for the jury. One thing they're doing that's interesting as well is they're crossing the victims. And actually, they open with female attorneys and younger female attorneys. I mean, that's sort of the conventional wisdom. You don't want an older, overbearing male cross-examining a victim of sex abuse or sexual assault. So the fact that you have females making these arguments and saying that this was all consensual, that this was just physical violence, it wasn't sexual, I think the defense has done a good job there.
And then one more for you, Nima. Just in general, when it comes to communicating to a jury, because when I think of a mob boss, I think of Al Capone. Here's Sean Combs, and for a lot of people, he was someone they enjoyed his music. Brands like Ciroc, Sean John, I mean, these were very public-facing brands. How difficult is it as a prosecutor to take a juror and to get them to say, a mob boss isn't just an Al Capone. It's not just a cartel El Chapo type leader. This is Sean Combs. You may have known him through the media, and all these public things you saw, actually, this was a criminal organization.
Like, it's not easy because it's not your typical case. What makes it more challenging is jurors love celebrities, and I've represented celebrities, I've sued celebrities. That's just the reality in this country. They tend to do well in both civil and criminal trials. Some of it is the fact that they have a lot of money and can hire the best and brightest lawyers in the country. I mean, Combs has assembled a dream team on his own. But if you want to prove racketeering, what you have to do is go through those elements and just say, listen, racketeering is not what you think it is. The racket, the enterprise, right? It just has to be some sort of loose organization. And you have Bad Boy Records, and you have all these individuals who are working for Combs. They're buying the baby oil, they're buying the lube, they're buying the condoms, they're setting up the hotel rooms with the candles, right? They're setting up the freak-offs. And what are they doing afterwards? They're cleaning everything up, right? The drugs, the oil all over the walls, the handprints everywhere. They are helping facilitate these illegal acts. Some of them would get prescription drugs for Combs, the Percocet. Some of them would witness and participate in trafficking the illegal drugs, right? They are all doing this at the direction of Sean Combs. So it doesn't have to be a mob boss who's ordering all of this. It can be anyone, including the head of a record company. That's enough for racketeering. And of course, you do have that pattern of racketeering activity, which just requires those 2 predicate acts within a 10-year period, which we have.
All right, we'll see what comes next. It's been just an incredible case trial thus far, and in some ways we're just getting started. Still a couple weeks into it. Former federal prosecutor, president of West Coast Trial Lawyers, Nima Rahmani, thank you for taking the time to be with us on Law and Crime. It's always great to have you.
Thanks, Chris. I'm sure we'll talk soon.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.